The rain was relentless that night, a curtain of silver slicing through the New York skyline. From the 27th floor of the Grand Metropolitan Hotel, the city looked like it was weeping lights, blurring into streaks of gold and gray against the downpour. Cinnamon. Judith stood under the awning, her breath visible in the cold. She tightened her grip on a worn leather purse, the edges soft from years of use. Inside, tucked between her ID and a half-eaten granola bar, was a folded hospital bill, the kind of paper that could drain hope faster than it could absorb tears. She was 28 and already felt ancient. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "Everything's going to be okay, sweetheart. We've survived worse." But the doctor's voice had been colder. Stage 3. Aggressive. Immediate treatment required. The insurance company's email had been even colder still. Denied. Pre-existing condition. Now room 1542 waited above her, a number that had pulsed on her phone for days, attached to a man's name she'd never met but couldn't stop imagining. "He helps people," her friend Sarah had said at work, her tone walking a line between envy and disbelief. "He's not like the others, Sin. No strings attached. Well, maybe one." Cinnamon had laughed it off at the time. But laughter didn't pay for chemotherapy. So here she was, soaked, trembling, and about to make a choice that would change her life forever. The doorman gave her a soft, knowing look as she hesitated at the entrance. "Ma'am, do you need assistance?" She forced a smile, though her throat felt lined with glass. "No. Thank you." Her voice cracked on the last word. Inside the lobby, glowed in muted gold's marble floors, reflecting chandeliers, guests moving like ghosts through luxury she could never afford. The elevator doors opened with a whisper. 15th floor, room 1542, 8:00 p.m. Each step down the hallway felt like a countdown. Her heels clicked softly against the carpet, echoing her heartbeat. She stopped at the door. Her reflection in the brass number plate looked unfamiliar. Dark curls damp from the rain, eyes too bright with fear, lips pressed into determination. For one moment, she wanted to run, but then she thought of her mother's smile, fragile and fading, and she lifted her hand to knock. The door opened before she touched it. Darren Emerson stood there. She recognized him instantly, not from tabloids or television, but from the quiet certainty in his gaze. The kind of man who didn't need to speak to fill a room. He was tall, the lines of his charcoal suit softening against the low light. His tie was loosened, his collar slightly undone, a single flaw that made him human. "Miss Judith?" he asked, voice deep but gentle. She nodded, unable to trust her own. "Please," he said, stepping aside. "Come in." The suite was understated, not the decadent fantasy she had imagined. Cream-colored sofas, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the storm, a bottle of unopened wine, a single candle burning on the table, its flame flickering with the wind that slipped through the half-open balcony door. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he admitted. Cinnamon set her purse on the nearest chair. "I almost didn't." "Why did you—" The question was simple, but it stripped her bare. She turned toward the window, watching the rain blur the city lights. "Because I don't have a choice." Her voice trembled, but she refused to cry. "Not here. Not yet." He didn't move closer, didn't touch her. Just stood a few feet away, quiet, observing. "You said your mother's sick," he said softly. "Yes." She turned back to him. "They can treat her. But the cost." Her words dissolved into air. She opened her purse, pulled out the folded bills, and placed them on the table. "This is everything I have left. It's not enough." He looked at the papers but didn't touch them. Instead, he studied her, the tight line of her jaw, the defiance in her posture. the exhaustion behind her eyes. "I lost my mother 5 years ago," he said quietly. "All the money in the world couldn't save her. But your mother still has a chance." Something cracked in her composure. "Then why are you doing this?" she whispered. He hesitated, not out of guilt, but honesty. "Because I can help, and because sometimes helping someone else feels like redemption." Their eyes met, and for a moment the room seemed to shrink until there was only the sound of rain and two people standing in the middle of an impossible decision. When he finally spoke again, his tone was careful. "I can pay for her treatment. Everything, no repayment needed." She stared at him. "Why?" "Because I can," he said. Then softer, "But there's a condition." Her heart stuttered. "What kind of condition?" "One night," he said. "Only that. If you want to leave afterward, you can. No questions. No expectations." The air thickened between them, heavy with things neither of them wanted to name. She laughed, a small, brittle sound. "You make it sound like a business deal." "Maybe it is," he murmured, "but you deserve to make that choice freely." Cinnamon looked at the door. It was still open, just a few steps away. She could leave, keep her pride, watch her mother die slowly, or stay and lose something she wasn't sure she could ever get back. The storm outside cracked like judgment. "I'll stay," she whispered. He stepped closer, slow enough for her to move away if she wanted to. She didn't. When his fingers brushed her cheek, it wasn't desire that broke her. It was kindness. His touch was steady, reverent, almost apologetic. "Are you sure?" he asked. "No," she breathed. "But I have to be." Later, she would remember fragments. The warmth of his hands, the way the candlelight softened the sharpness of his face, the sound of rain against the windows. No words, just a rhythm of heartbeats finding each other in the dark. She told herself it was survival. He told himself it was mercy. But somewhere between those lies, something real took root. When he kissed her, it wasn't lust. It was two lonely people trying to forget the weight of their lives, if only for a night. The dawn came pale and cold. Cinnamon woke to the quiet hum of the city and the faint scent of coffee. Darren was gone. On the nightstand rested a check folded neatly under a handwritten note. "For your mother's treatment. No repayment. Take care of her and yourself." Her hand trembled as she read it. Not because of the money, but because of the last line. And yourself. No one had told her that in years. She looked around the suite. The empty wine glasses, the unmade bed, the city stretching endlessly below. A single droplet of water fell from her hair onto the check, blurring his signature. She folded it carefully, tucked it into her purse, and left before the sun had fully risen. Outside, the city smelled of wet asphalt and beginning. The morning traffic was already roaring, impatient and unaware that a life had just shifted somewhere between two heartbeats. Cinnamon didn't cry. She walked straight to the hospital, handed the check to the billing office, and signed the paperwork with shaking hands. Her mother's treatment began that afternoon. When she sat by the bedside later, watching her mother sleep under the hum of machines, she whispered, "Everything's going to be okay, Mama, I promise." But deep down, she knew that promise came with a price. That night, when she finally returned home to her tiny apartment, the scent of rain still clinging to her coat, she undressed slowly, each layer a reminder of the woman she had been just 24 hours ago. The girl who'd believed dignity was unbreakable. The woman who'd learned that love and survival sometimes looked too much alike. She turned off the light and sat by the window listening to the city breathe. Somewhere out there, Darren Emerson was probably sitting in another high-rise suite, untouched by consequence, already moving on. At least, That's what she wanted to believe. But across the city, in a penthouse overlooking the same skyline, Darren wasn't sleeping either. He sat at his desk, staring at a blank page. His tie was still undone, the candle from last night still burning on his table. He could still smell her rain jasmine, and something else. Something that didn't belong to the night. He tried to write a check for a foundation project, then stopped halfway. His pen hovered, then dropped. He didn't know her, not really. But her eyes, the defiance and the fear in them, had carved into him deeper than he wanted to admit. By morning, both had convinced themselves it was over. A transaction completed. A moment to forget. Yet, as Cinnamon brushed her hair in the mirror, her fingers hesitated over the small bruise on her collarbone, a mark that felt less like shame and more like a memory. And as Darren walked into his boardroom, surrounded by suits and stock reports, he found himself wondering for the first time in years what it meant to feel alive. That night, as the rain returned, Cinnamon stood at her window again. The city shimmered beneath her, a sea of light stretching into forever. She placed a hand over her chest, where his heartbeat had once echoed against hers. Just one night, she whispered to herself. That's all. But deep inside, something pulsed differently. A rhythm, softer, slower, fragile, yet unstoppable. And far away in the darkened sky over New York, the first lightning cracked open the clouds, revealing a faint shimmer of dawn. Neither of them knew it yet, but that storm had left behind more than thunder. It had left a spark, small, hidden, waiting to grow. The kind that could light up a lifetime. The test took 3 minutes. 3 impossibly long minutes that stretched like hours inside the tiny bathroom of her one-bedroom apartment. Outside, the city was waking car horns, footsteps, the dull hum of a world that didn't stop for anyone's crisis. But inside, Cinnamon, Judith sat on the cool edge of the bathtub, fingers trembling, eyes locked on the white stick lying across the sink. 2 faint red lines. For a long moment, she couldn't breathe. Then she laughed, a soft, broken sound that wasn't quite joy, but wasn't despair either. It was relief. It was terror. It was life, stubborn and uninvited, growing inside her despite everything. Of course, she whispered, voice barely audible. Of course it would be you. Her reflection in the cracked mirror looked back with a strange calmness, as if some part of her already knew this would happen, that the night she'd tried to bury had left her something she could never hide. That night returned to her in flashes, rain against the window, the warmth of his hands, the way Darren had looked at her, not like a man buying time, but like someone seeing her for the first time. She pressed a palm over her abdomen, her breath catching. "You don't deserve this," she murmured. "Neither of us do." But then she remembered her mother sleeping peacefully for the first time in months, the machines humming quietly beside her. The treatments had begun, paid for in full. Cinnamon's throat tightened. She'd sold one part of herself to save another, and now life was demanding more of her, a consequence wrapped in heartbeat and innocence. She sank to the floor and cried. Not because she regretted that night, but because she didn't know if she could survive its memory. The next morning, she made a decision. By dawn, she had packed what little they owned. Her mother's sweaters, her sketchbooks, a few clothes, and a folder of medical documents. They left New York before the city fully opened its eyes. The drive to the lakeside town took 5 hours. Her mother slept most of the way, exhausted from treatment, her head resting gently against the window. Cinnamon watched the skyline fade in the rearview mirror, glass towers dissolving into open sky, and felt something inside her unclench. The air grew cleaner, the roads quieter. It was as if the world itself was giving her space to begin again. The town was small Maple Harbor, a place where the lake met the forest, and strangers were noticed before they were known. She rented a modest house at the edge of town, white paint peeling a garden overgrown, but sunlight filled the rooms. It was enough. In the mornings, she would walk her mother to the porch where the air smelled of pine and rain. Then she'd drive to the grocery store or the local print shop looking for work. At night, when the house grew quiet, she'd sit by the window, hand resting on her stomach, whispering to the tiny heartbeat beneath her skin. "You're the only right thing I ever did wrong," she said once, smiling through tears. The baby fluttered for the first time that night, a soft, unfamiliar motion, like a secret knocking from the inside. It didn't feel like punishment anymore. It felt like purpose. But peace never came without its shadow. By the third month, whispers began the kind small towns collect like dust. A young woman alone, her mother sick, no ring, no husband in sight. At the pharmacy, someone said softly, "Poor thing, must have made a mistake." Cinnamon pretended not to hear. One afternoon, a neighbor, Mrs. Walsh, an elderly widow with kind eyes, brought over soup and curiosity. "Your husband couldn't come with you?" she asked gently. Cinnamon smiled. "No husband, just us." Mrs. Walsh's face softened. "Then you're brave, dear." But there was pity in her voice, and pity always cut deeper than judgment. That night, Cinnamon went to the lake. The water shimmered with moonlight, still and endless. She wrapped her coat tighter around her and whispered into the quiet, "I made a choice. You don't have to pay for it." The baby kicked again, stronger this time, as if answering her. She smiled. "All right then, we'll be fine." Time folded itself into seasons. Her mother's health improved slowly, color returning to her cheeks. Cinnamon found work designing posters for the town's art fair. Her hands, once stiff with fear, rediscovered the rhythm of creation. Each night she painted, not for clients, but for herself, bursts of color and light across canvas, trying to paint what hope might look like if it had a face. Sometimes, without realizing it, she painted him a man standing in the rain, a faint smile caught in the corner of his mouth, eyes like dawn after a long storm. When she finished, she'd stare at the painting and whisper, "You can't be here." But he always was in her dreams, in the way she caught herself glancing at strangers in suits, half expecting to see his face. At 6 months, she received a letter, a clean cream envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sentence typed unsigned, "I hope she's better." No name, no hint. But she didn't need one. She sat on the porch for a long time, the wind moving gently through her hair. So he remembered. She wanted to write back to say thank you, to tell him about the baby, about how the world had shifted because of one night. But what would she say? That she'd fallen in love with a man she wasn't supposed to keep. Instead, she folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her sketchbook between a drawing of the lake and another of the child's first imagined face. That night, she dreamed of him again. But this time, he wasn't standing in the rain. He was standing in sunlight, holding a small child who laughed and reached for her. When she woke, tears stained her pillow. As her belly grew, so did her strength. She learned to fix the leaky roof to balance the bills to cook without burning the rice. Her mother would tease her gently. "You're glowing, sweetheart." Cinnamon laughed. "That's just the morning sickness." But there was truth in it. She was glowing not from perfection, but from resilience. From the quiet pride of building something new, from the ruins of shame. One evening, as the sun melted into the lake, she stood barefoot in the garden. The air smelled of rain-soaked soil. She pressed both hands over her stomach and whispered, "Little one, when you come, the world will be different. Not perfect, but kinder. I'll make sure of it." The baby kicked again, and she laughed through her tears. Somewhere deep inside, she knew this child would not just change her, he would change everything. But shadows still found her. Some nights the memories crept in his voice, his touch, the way he had looked at her with something dangerously close to tenderness. What if he had wanted to know? What if she had stayed? She would sit up in bed, heart pounding, staring at the ceiling until dawn. But every time doubt whispered, she'd hear her mother coughing in the next room, and she'd remember why she'd chosen silence. He had saved her mother's life. She couldn't burden him with another knot when the world would call it his mistake. It was better this way. Safer. Cleaner. At least, that's what she told herself. The night before her due date, a thunderstorm swept across Maple Harbor. Rain lashed the windows, the lake roaring like a wounded beast. Cinnamon sat alone, cradling her swollen belly, watching the lightning dance across the sky. Every flash lit up the paintings on her wall, all the colors of her grief and gratitude. And in that flickering light she saw it clearly. This wasn't a punishment. It was a second chance. When the first contraction hit, she didn't panic. She simply whispered, "It's time." By the time they reached the hospital, the storm had quieted. Hours later, as dawn broke through a veil of gray, a cry pierced the stillness, strong, fierce, alive. The nurse smiled. "Congratulations, Miss Judith. It's a boy." Cinnamon looked down at the tiny face pressed against her chest, soft curls, a delicate nose, and when he blinked open his eyes, a glint of gray-blue that caught her breath. Darren's eyes. Her tears fell freely now, soaking the newborn's blanket. "Hello, my love," she whispered. "Welcome to the world." Outside, the rain had stopped. The lake shimmered under the new sun, its surface calm, its depths forever changed. Cinnamon closed her eyes and felt the tiny heartbeat against hers, steady, certain, unafraid. Somewhere deep inside, a new promise formed, one she would carry for years to come. "You are my beginning, not my mistake." And though she would never admit it aloud, as she held her son for the first time, she knew she had never really left that night behind. It had simply taken root. 9 years had passed since the storm. The lake still glittered in the mornings, but the ripples carried laughter. Now the laughter of a boy with curls soft as silk and eyes the color of light filtered through rain. Abraham Judith, age 9, ran barefoot across the grass behind their small house, a paintbrush in one hand and a dragonfly jar in the other. His mother watched from the porch, coffee cooling in her hands. He was her echo and her miracle, the only chapter of her life she'd never regret. Though sometimes when he smiled, her chest tightened painfully. Because that smile, the faint lopsided curve at the corner of his mouth, wasn't hers. It belonged to a man she hadn't seen since the night she lost herself and found him. Cinnamon's days followed a steady rhythm now. She was a freelance designer, working for small-town businesses, charity events, and occasionally a city client who found her through word of mouth. She didn't make much, but it was enough. Enough to keep the lights on, to fill the fridge, to buy her son watercolor paper and good brushes. The house smelled of paint and cinnamon tea. On her walls hung her own designs, abstract shapes that looked like memories trying to heal themselves. And on the largest wall near the window overlooking the lake hung Abraham's art, his dragons, dozens of them. Some large and vivid wings stretched toward sunlight, others small and faint, glowing softly, as if their fire burned from within. "They don't breathe fire," he once told her, serious as a philosopher. "They breathe light. Because fire hurts people. Light helps them see." She'd smiled, blinking back tears. "Then yours must be the gentlest dragons in the world. They protect you, Mama," he'd added matter-of-factly, "even when I'm asleep." It was impossible to argue with that kind of faith. Her mother, now in full remission, lived nearby, and often stopped by with soup or advice Cinnamon didn't ask for. But she'd earned that right. "You're doing a fine job," she'd say, watching Abraham draw at the kitchen table. "He's turning out like his mother, full of heart and imagination." Cinnamon would smile, though she knew it wasn't entirely true. There were moments, fleeting but sharp, when Abraham looked up from his sketches with that same calm focus, that quiet gravity that Darren had. The way his brow furrowed when he concentrated, the way he tilted his head when something moved him, the way he smiled without showing all his teeth, a secret smile like he was saving a thought for later. Sometimes it felt like ghosts lived in her child's gestures. Late one evening, while cleaning his room, Cinnamon found a drawing tucked under his pillow. It was of her standing at the window, hair loose, light spilling over her shoulder. But behind her, half hidden in shadow, was a man. A tall figure, faceless, but unmistakably present. She stared at it for a long time. When she finally asked him about it the next morning, he only shrugged. "That's the dream man," he said. "The dream man. He's always there when I'm scared. He doesn't talk, but I know he's not bad." "Why do you think that?" "Because when he's there, the dragons shine brighter." Her hands shook. She forced a smile. "That's beautiful, sweetheart." He grinned, and there it was again, that familiar curve in his smile that both comforted and haunted her. In the small town of Maple Harbor, Abraham's talent was impossible to overlook. By 7, his teachers called him a prodigy. By 9, his art teacher submitted his work to the citywide children's art exhibition in Chicago. When the letter of acceptance arrived, Cinnamon read it twice before believing it. "They picked you," she whispered. "You're going to exhibit your paintings in the city." Abraham gasped. "The city? Like where all the tall buildings live?" She laughed, ruffling his curls. "Exactly. We'll make a weekend of it." That night, after he'd gone to bed, she sat in her studio, surrounded by sketches and half-finished designs. The city meant more than an art show. It meant going back. Back to where everything had started. Back to where she'd last seen him. The thought made her pulse quicken and her throat tighten. 9 years had passed. Surely he'd forgotten. Men like Darren Emerson didn't linger on ghosts. But still, a quiet fear bloomed in her chest. What if fate wasn't done with her yet? Over the following weeks, Abraham worked on his exhibition piece with the fierce concentration of an artist twice his age. He titled it, "The Guardian of Dreams." On the canvas, he painted a child standing beneath a giant dragon made of golden light. But beside the dragon, faint, almost hidden in shadow, stood a man. Not menacing, not fully visible, but solid, protective. The figure's hand rested lightly on the child's shoulder. Cinnamon watched him work the brush, moving in sure, confident strokes. "Who's the man, honey?" she asked softly. Abraham didn't look up. "He's the one who protects us when the dragons get tired." Her throat tightened. "Protects us." He nodded. "You and me. I think he loves us." Cinnamon froze, her heart thudding painfully against her ribs. He turned to her with that smile, that crooked, familiar smile, and for the first time in years, she had to look away. The night before the exhibition, she packed carefully Abraham's clothes, her portfolio, in case a potential client appeared, her mother's rosary, though she wasn't religious anymore. Outside, the lake shimmered under the moonlight. She stood by the window, staring at their reflection, her and her son, silhouettes against the glass. He stirred in his sleep behind her, murmuring something about dragons. And though the house was still, she could almost feel another presence, faint but familiar, like a memory brushing past her. She whispered into the darkness, "Please, don't come back. Let him have his peace." But the night remained silent, indifferent. The train ride to Chicago was long, the rhythmic clatter of wheels merging with the hum of Abraham's excitement. He pressed his nose to the window, watching the skyline grow out of the horizon. "Do you think people will like my dragons?" he asked. "They'll love them," she said, smiling. "And if they don't, then they'll learn to," she teased, touching his cheek. He giggled, and again that curve in his smile caught the light. It was so achingly familiar that for a moment she had to look away. 9 years, and still the memory of that man lived quietly inside her child's laughter. She wondered if that was how fate worked, not as punishment, but as a reminder. The Chicago Art Museum was alive with color and noise when they arrived. Children's artwork lined the walls. Robots, animals, dreamscapes, family portraits. Cinnamon helped Abraham hang his canvas in the section labeled Light and Imagination. When she stepped back to look at it, her breath caught. The guardian of dreams. The figure beside the dragon was clearer now. The brushwork was delicate but deliberate, broad shoulders, calm posture, a faint suggestion of a smile in the shadow. It wasn't just imagination. It was memory, one he could never have. Cinnamon swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. The museum air smelled faintly of varnish and old wood. People began to gather, murmuring softly, admiring the glow that seemed to radiate from Abraham's painting. He painted the light with feeling, one critic said to another. "That's rare." Abraham beamed. "Mama, they like it." She smiled, kneeling beside him. "Of course they do, baby. How could they not?" But deep inside, unease, stirred, quiet, insistent, as if the world was holding its breath for something she couldn't yet see. Later, while Abraham played with other children near the refreshment table, Cinnamon walked alone through the exhibition hall. The sound of laughter, the rustle of clothes, the faint hum of air conditioning filled her ears. She should have felt proud she was proud, but beneath it all, an invisible thread tugged at her, a feeling she hadn't felt in years, the sense of being watched. She turned, scanning the crowd, her heartbeat picking up for no reason she could name. Nothing. Just people, parents, strangers. Still, the air seemed to change, heavier somehow, sharper. She shook her head, forcing a laugh at her own nerves. "Stop it, Sin. He's not here. He can't be." But fate, quiet, patient, inevitable, was already setting its pieces in motion. Across the room at the far end of the gallery, a man in a dark suit paused before the guardian of dreams. The crowd blurred around him, voices fading into distant echoes. His breath caught, and for a long, motionless moment, he couldn't look away. The curve of the child's smile. The light. The name printed neatly on the placard below, artist Abraham Judith, age 9. Something inside him shifted, recognition, crashing through logic like a tide breaking its shore. He whispered the name once more, barely audible. Judith. And across the room, Cinnamon felt the faint tremor of something she had prayed never to face again. The exhibition hall shimmered with light white walls, glass ceilings, a sea of people moving beneath a canopy of color. The air hummed with voices, soft laughter, the faint scent of varnish and linen. But for Darren Emerson, time stopped at a single painting. He hadn't planned to come. He rarely attended these charity events personally anymore, though his foundation sponsored most of them. His assistants handled the speeches, the photos, the handshakes. He just wrote the checks. That morning, though, something had drawn him here, an unexplainable pull like a whisper from the past he couldn't ignore. And now, standing in front of a canvas titled The Guardian of Dreams, he understood why. At first it was just light and color, a child beneath a dragon woven from golden strokes, a man in shadow beside them. But then he saw it, the smile. That familiar, half-curved smile, quiet, calm, achingly human. It was his, and the child. The tilt of the head, The soft curls, the faint trace of his own childhood in the eyes. It was him too. The nameplate below the painting confirmed what his heart already knew. Artist: Abraham. Judith. Age 9. Judith. The word hit like a chord struck in an empty cathedral. His breath left him. 9 years of silence collapsed into that single sound, Judith. He said it again under his breath, the syllables trembling with disbelief. The crowd around him blurred. He barely heard the curator's voice or the chatter of parents praising their children. All he could see was the painting and the name. And suddenly he was moving. Across the hall, Cinnamon stood near a cluster of other parents. Her face turned toward the light streaming from the skylight. She looked different, softer somehow, yet stronger. Her curls were shorter, her posture more grounded. Time had touched her, but hadn't dimmed her. Darren stopped a few feet away. For a heartbeat, he couldn't breathe. She hadn't seen him yet. She was smiling at her son, who was busy showing his sketchbook to another child. The sound of Abraham's laughter, his son's laughter, reached him through the noise, light and pure. Something inside him cracked open. 9 years of quiet, of pretending that one night hadn't changed him, dissolved like smoke. And then she turned. Their eyes met. It was like standing in front of the same storm that had started it all, the one that had destroyed and remade them in a single breath. Her smile faltered. The paper cup in her hand trembled. The space between them shrank into a silence so heavy it hummed. Cinnamon. His voice was lower than he intended, almost reverent. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. For a moment, she just stared, as if her mind couldn't reconcile the man in front of her with the one she'd left behind 9 years ago. He looked different. Older, of course, lines etched near his eyes, silver threading through his hair, but still him. The same steadiness, the same impossible calm. Darren, she finally whispered. He took a step closer, then another. I didn't know you were here, she said, voice barely holding. I didn't either. His gaze flicked to the painting. Until I saw this. Her throat tightened. You shouldn't have come. I didn't mean to. You never do, she said, almost to herself. For a moment, neither moved. The crowd carried on around them, oblivious. But in that pocket of stillness, time folded in on itself. Darren's eyes shifted toward the boy, Abraham, who now stood near the refreshment table, his curls glowing in the afternoon light. The resemblance was undeniable. Is he? Cinnamon's eyes filled before she could answer. She didn't speak, just nodded once. Small, fragile final. Darren exhaled, the sound breaking like glass. 9 years of what-ifs fell away, replaced by a single truth. My God, he whispered. All this time. Cinnamon blinked back tears. Don't, please. He looked at her, searching her face. Why didn't you tell me? She shook her head. Because it wouldn't have changed anything. You don't know that. I do, she said quietly. You had your world, Darren, and I had to build mine. He took another step, his voice soft but edged. You think I wouldn't have wanted to be part of his life? I think you didn't even know you wanted a life like that, she said. Back then, you were drowning in grief, trying to buy redemption, one good deed at a time. I was just another one of them. He flinched. You were never one of them. Her laugh came out brittle. Weren't I? You paid for my mother's treatment. You walked away. That's what men like you do. You fix what you can and disappear before it asks anything real of you. The words stung, but he didn't argue. He couldn't. Because she wasn't wrong, at least not then. But now, seeing that boy, seeing the way he laughed, the way he painted Darren, knew something had shifted inside him forever. He had missed it all. His first steps, his first words, his first laugh, and the knowledge hollowed him. A voice called from behind Abraham's teacher. "Mrs. Judith. They want to take photos with the winners." Cinnamon turned, wiping quickly at her eyes. "Coming." Darren watched as she crossed the room, her composure sliding back into place with practiced grace. Abraham spotted her and ran forward, holding her hand, pulling her toward the stage. He grinned at the photographer, and that smile again. That unmistakable echo of himself. Darren stood frozen, caught between awe and regret. When the flash went off, the burst of white light seared through him, a cruel metaphor for everything he'd lost in the dark. After the ceremony, when most guests had left, Cinnamon found him still standing by the painting. "You shouldn't look at it that way," she said quietly. He didn't turn. "How should I look at it? Like art, not memory?" He smiled faintly. "But it is memory, isn't it? Even if he doesn't know it." She sighed. "He thinks the man in that painting is a dream." "Let's leave it that way." Darren finally faced her. "You really think you can keep the truth from him forever?" Her expression hardened. "He doesn't need a man who shows up 9 years late." The words hit like a slap. He nodded slowly, pain flickering behind his calm. "Maybe not, but I need to know him." "Why now?" she asked. "Guilt." "No," he said. "Because the moment I saw him, I felt alive. Like something I lost the night I met you finally came back." She looked away. "Don't romanticize this, Darren. It was never a love story." He stepped closer, voice low. "Then why does it still feel like one?" For a long moment, silence hung between them, charged and fragile. She could feel the old pull, that dangerous gravity that once undid her. But this time, she wasn't the same woman. She had built a life from scratch. She had something to lose. And yet the look in his eyes, part wonder, part sorrow, made her tremble. "You can't just walk in and expect to rewrite everything," she said softly. "I don't want to rewrite it," he answered. "I just want to understand it." Cinnamon's eyes flicked toward Abraham, now packing his sketchbook. "He's my whole world. Don't take that from me." "I don't want to take it," he said gently. "I just want to be part of it." Her throat worked. "You have no idea how dangerous that could be." "For whom?" "For all of us." He took a step back, recognizing the wall she'd built. One born not of anger, but fear. "I'll wait," he said quietly. "For what?" "For you to believe that I'm not the same man you walked away from." And before she could answer, he turned and left, his footsteps echoing through the empty hall. Cinnamon watched him go, her heart pounding in her chest like something trying to escape. When she finally looked back at the painting, the light had shifted. The golden tones glowed differently now, more alive, as if the dragon itself had been waiting for this moment. She exhaled slowly, whispering to no one, "You weren't supposed to find us." But somewhere deep inside, another voice answered, softer, older, undeniable. "He was always meant to." Later that night, after Abraham had fallen asleep in their hotel room, Cinnamon stood by the window. Chicago shimmered outside the city that had given her everything and taken everything away. Her reflection stared back, older, wiser, but trembling. Down the street at the same hour, Darren stood at his penthouse window, looking at the same city lights. Two souls divided by time and distance, but for the first time in 9 years, both awake in the same light. And somewhere in between them, the child who carried both their smiles dreamed of dragons that glowed brighter than ever before. The city felt different now, heavier, charged with something neither of them could name. After the exhibition, Life did not return to what it was. It never could. Darren began showing up. Not in grand gestures, he didn't send gifts or lawyers. Instead, he appeared in quiet places, waiting outside Abraham's art class, dropping off paint supplies, anonymously volunteering at the community center, where Cinnamon taught design. He wasn't trying to reclaim the past. He was trying to earn a future. But even kindness, when watched too closely, becomes suspicion. Cinnamon noticed the way eyes followed her in the grocery store. The whispers. That's her, the one with Emerson's son. She hated the pity more than the gossip. When she confronted him, her voice trembled. Do you have any idea what it's like to live in your shadow? To see our names whispered like a scandal? Darren's calm finally cracked. I never wanted that for you. I just wanted to be near him. You already have everything, Darren. Don't take the only thing that's mine. He flinched as if struck. I'm not taking anything. I'm just trying to give back what I should have been. Her reply was soft but final. You can't give back 9 years. They stood on the curb outside her house, silence hanging between them like fog. The streetlight above flickered, catching raindrops in its glow. Neither moved until Abraham's voice called from inside Mama, and the world snapped back into motion. At first, Abraham was thrilled. Mama, he's nice, he said after Darren helped him set up a new canvas. He doesn't treat me like a kid. He listens. Cinnamon forced a smile, but every word carved deeper into her heart. She didn't want to be jealous of her son's joy, but love, even the purest kind, can twist when threatened. Days blurred into weeks. Their lives began orbiting each other in fragile, overlapping circles. Darren took Abraham to the museum. Cinnamon taught her son to say no to reporters. When Darren came over, the air thickened. Polite words, careful smiles. Underneath, old fires smoldered. One evening after Abraham had gone to bed, Darren lingered by the door. I still see her in you, he said softly. Cinnamon turned away. Don't. I can't help it. Her voice trembled. We can't afford this. Not now. He stepped closer. You mean you can't afford to feel it again? The space between them crackled memory, desire, fear. Then she whispered, leave before we make another mistake. And he did. But the look he gave her before walking out stayed a look that said, we already did. The press finally caught on. A photo in a tabloid, billionaire art patron, spotted with single mother and gifted son. Then another headline. Then questions at the school gate. Abraham began to shrink into silence. He stopped painting dragons, stopped talking about dreams. One night, Cinnamon found him sitting by the window clutching torn pieces of his old canvas. Baby, what happened? His voice cracked. They keep saying things. About you. About me. About him. Her heart sank. You don't have to listen to them. But it's true, isn't it? He cried. He's my dad. The truth she'd tried to protect him from was now his wound to carry. Abraham, I don't want him to come anymore. He shouted, tears spilling over. The dragons don't protect anyone. They just make people fight. Before she could stop him, he ripped the last painting apart, the golden dragon that once glowed with light, shredding it until only color and paper remained. Then he buried his face in her lap and sobbed. Make it stop, Mama. Please. When Darren came the next morning, the air inside the house was sharp with silence. Cinnamon stood by the doorway, eyes rimmed red. He knows, she said. He looked past her, saw the scraps of torn paper scattered on the floor like fallen wings. I didn't want this, he whispered. Neither did I. But you lit a fire and thought you could control it. I just wanted... Her voice cut him off. He's not a symbol of your redemption, Darren. He's a child. My child. That word hit him harder than any insult could. He nodded slowly, rain streaking down his coat. Then I'll leave. Good. But not because I don't care, he said, voice breaking. Because I do. Too much. Outside, the sky was bruised with storm. He stood in the rain for a long time, watching the light from their window flicker. Inside, Cinnamon sat with Abraham, holding him close until his sobs faded into sleep. When she finally looked out, Darren was still there, soaked, motionless, staring up at the window where his family should have been. Through the glass, their eyes met one last time. She couldn't open the door. He didn't try to knock. Instead, he whispered something she couldn't hear, but somehow understood. I don't need to win. I just need him to be happy. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the downpour. Cinnamon stood there long after he was gone, the sound of rain merging with her heartbeat. Two dragons, one made of light, one of fire, circling the same sky, both trying to protect what they loved and burning themselves in the process. That night, Abraham slept restlessly, murmuring in dreams. Cinnamon brushed the curls from his forehead and whispered, "You're safe, baby. You always will be." But when she turned out the light, the pieces of the torn dragon glowed faintly under the moon, as if waiting for the day they'd learn to fly again. The house had fallen silent. The laughter that once filled it, Abraham's laughter, was gone now, leaving behind the echo of brushes, left unused canvases, gathering dust, and a mother who no longer knew how to reach her son. Days stretched like muted film reels. Mornings came pale and empty. Evenings dissolved into the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint tapping of rain against glass. Cinnamon sat at the kitchen table most nights, her fingers tracing circles on a chipped mug of tea gone cold. Across the room, Abraham's easel stood in the corner, abandoned, a monument to the joy that had once burned there. The brushes were stiff, the paint hardened in its jars. The last thing he'd drawn, a half-finished dragon, sat untouched on the canvas, its eyes uncolored, its wings fading into nothing. It hurt to look at it. It hurt even more not to. Since that night, the night of the shouting, the tears, the storm, Abraham had changed. He woke later, spoke less, and spent long hours sitting by the window, staring at the lake, as if it held answers only he could hear. At 9, his silence felt too grown. Cinnamon tried everything: pancakes in the shape of dragons, trips to the park, even music during breakfast. Nothing worked. He would smile politely, but it was hollow, practiced. His light, the same light that used to glow in every laugh, every painting, had dimmed. And every time she saw that absence, she felt her own heart dim with it. One afternoon, while cleaning his room, she found a folded sheet of drawing paper hidden beneath his pillow. The lines were shaky but deliberate. Two dragons, one white and one dark, turning away from each other. Between them stood a small figure, a boy slowly fading into gray. Cinnamon froze. Her throat tightened, breath catching like glass in her chest. She sat down on the edge of the bed, fingers trembling as she traced the boy's outline, almost invisible, almost gone. For the first time since he'd stopped painting, she cried. Not the quiet tears she'd allowed herself before, but deep, trembling sobs that shook her shoulders and tore through the silence of the room. All the things she'd kept buried, guilt, anger, exhaustion, fear, spilled out in one long, shattering release. And when the storm inside her finally broke, she reached for the phone. Darren answered on the second ring. For a moment, neither spoke. She could hear rain in the background, a low, steady rhythm like breathing. When she finally found her voice, it came out small, fragile. "We have to stop." Stop. What his tone was gentle, wary. "This," she said. "Whatever this is. The visits, the calls, the half-trying. It's breaking him, Darren." He exhaled softly. Cinnamon. No. Listen to me. This isn't about you or me. It's about Abraham. He's disappearing right in front of us. A pause. Then his voice barely above a whisper. Tell me what to do. She closed her eyes, tears falling silently. Come tomorrow. We'll talk. All three of us. The next morning, gray clouds hovered low over the lake. They met at a small counseling office in town, a place that smelled faintly of rain and lavender. The walls were soft blue lined with children's drawings. A basket of crayons sat between the chairs. Abraham sat on the couch, his small hands folded tightly in his lap. Cinnamon sat beside him while Darren, who looked more tired than she'd ever seen him, took the seat across. The therapist, a woman with kind eyes and steady calm, smiled at them. Why don't we start simple, she said. Abraham, do you want to tell me how you've been feeling? He didn't answer. Cinnamon opened her mouth, but Darren shook his head gently, a silent plea to let the boy speak on his own. Minutes passed. Then finally, Abraham's voice, small breaking. When people talk about me, it feels like they're not really talking about me. The therapist nodded. What do you mean? They talk about my dad, he said, glancing at Darren and my mom, and how it's weird. Like I'm something they're fighting over. But I didn't do anything wrong. Cinnamon's chest caved inward. Baby. But Darren leaned forward first. His voice was rough, steady, real. You're right. You didn't do anything wrong. Abraham looked at him unsure. What happened between me and your mom? Darren continued. That's on us, not you. You are not a mistake, Abraham. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me. The boy blinked confused, then whispered, Even if I didn't know you before. Even then, Darren said. Especially then. The silence that followed was different this time, softer, almost sacred. Cinnamon felt something uncoil in her chest. She looked at Darren, and for the first time in months, there was no accusation in her eyes, only gratitude, quiet and aching. Abraham shifted closer to his father, hesitant at first, then fully. He reached out a small trembling hand, finding Darren's. And when Darren closed his fingers around it, something inside all three of them seemed to breathe again. The therapist smiled gently, writing nothing on her notepad. Some moments didn't need analysis. They just needed to exist. That afternoon, the rain returned. Cinnamon drove them home in silence. Abraham hummed softly in the back seat, the first sound of ease she'd heard from him in weeks. When they pulled into the driveway, he asked, Can I draw again? Cinnamon turned to him, tears threatening again, but this time they were warm. Of course you can. He grinned faintly. Maybe this time. The dragons can face each other. Darren laughed softly, a sound that filled the car like sunlight cutting through clouds. Later that evening, Cinnamon found herself standing at the window again. The rain traced soft paths down the glass. Behind her, Abraham's small voice carried from his room, low-focused, talking quietly to himself as he painted. She turned slightly. Darren was in the doorway watching her. He's okay, he said. She nodded. For now. He stepped closer. For now is enough. For a moment, she let herself believe him. They didn't talk about the future that night. Not about custody, or the media, or what came next. Instead, they sat in silence, listening to the storm outside, and the faint scratch of a paintbrush in the other room. Cinnamon realized how strange it was, how two people who'd once met in a storm could somehow find their way back through another one. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was something close. Before he left, Darren stopped at the door. You were right, you know. About what? We had to stop, he said softly. Not to give up, but to start over. She looked at him, the question in her eyes unspoken. He smiled a tired, hopeful smile. Next time we do it right. All three of us. And before she could reply, he was gone, stepping out into the rain, letting it wash him clean. Later, when she tucked Abraham into bed, he showed her his new drawing. 2 dragons, one white, one dark, no longer turning away. Between them stood the boy again. But this time, he wasn't fading. He was holding both their hands. Cinnamon brushed a tear from her cheek, kissed his forehead, and whispered, "It's beautiful." Abraham smiled sleepily. They stopped fighting. Now they protect each other. She smoothed his curls, whispering, "That's how real dragons love, sweetheart." When she turned off the light, the room glowed faintly from the canvas, the 2 dragons shining together, their light no longer lost, but shared. And in that quiet glow, Cinnamon finally exhaled. Maybe the light hadn't gone out after all. Maybe it had just learned where to belong. The sessions were supposed to be therapy, structured, timed, clinical, but they became something else entirely. By the 3rd week, Dr. Lowell had stopped guiding them. Instead, she set out paints and brushes, moved her chair to the corner, and simply watched as the Emerson-Judith trio built something wordless together. Abraham would sit between them, brow furrowed in deep concentration, paint smudges on his small fingers. Darren, in a neatly rolled-up shirt, tried his best to keep up, though half his dragons ended up looking like badly folded birds. Cinnamon couldn't help smiling. "Dad," Abraham giggled, "once you mixed too much blue again." "I like blue," Darren said, with a helpless grin. "It hides the mistakes." The boy shook his head, serious. "No, it just makes new colors." Cinnamon felt something shift inside her, then small, warm, dangerous. There was a lesson in that sentence, one even she hadn't learned yet. It wasn't easy, not all at once. Healing never was. Some days, Abraham woke up quiet again, staring at his brushes, but not touching them. Other days, Darren stayed too long, and Cinnamon found herself tensing, afraid of the old ache returning, the kind that made her forget where the boundaries were. But then, Abraham would reach for both their hands at once, one small hand holding 2 larger ones, and the moment would still. They were learning something fragile together. Not family, not yet, but something close. One afternoon during a session, Darren tried painting a sunrise and ended up with something that looked more like an explosion. Abraham stared at it, puzzled. "Why is your sun sad?" Darren laughed. "Maybe it's just tired." The boy thought about it. "Then it's okay. Even light needs to rest before shining again." The room went quiet. Cinnamon felt the sting of tears and turned away before either of them could see. When the sessions ended that day, Darren lingered at the door. Cinnamon was packing up brushes, her fingers stained with green and gold. He said softly, "You're different when you're painting." She didn't look up. "Maybe I'm just less guarded. I like you that way." She froze, then forced a light laugh. "Don't start that again." "I'm not," he said. "I just needed to say it. For myself." She turned then, meeting his eyes. They held years of apology, and something even harder to name, hope, perhaps, or faith. "Don't make promises you can't keep," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "I've already broken enough. I'd rather learn how not to." Before she could answer, Abraham called from outside, his laughter echoing down the hall. And just like that, the moment passed, but the air between them felt different, softer, alive. As weeks folded into months, the lake thawed. The snow that had clung to Maple Harbor melted into glittering water. The trees once bare bloomed shyly along the banks. Cinnamon felt it too, a quiet thawing inside her. She began drawing again for herself. Late at night, after Abraham was asleep, she'd sketch silhouettes, hands almost touching wings, unfurling faces half in shadow. Once she caught herself sketching Darren's smile. She tore the page out, but didn't throw it away. In the mornings he would stop by to pick up Abraham for school. He always brought coffee, one black one with oat milk, no sugar. The first time she asked, "How did you remember?" He'd smiled. "Some things don't forget you, even when you try to forget them." She didn't respond, but the warmth from that cup lingered long after he left. Abraham flourished again. His new series of drawings filled the living room. Dragons. Yes, but not like before. They weren't fighting or turning away. They were learning. Flying awkwardly, wings tangled, yet always together. One afternoon, he showed them his latest piece. "This one's special," he said, eyes shining. The dragon on the left was white and gleaming. The one on the right, dark and soft-edged, shimmered with flecks of gold. And in between, a smaller figure, arms stretched wide, holding both by the wingtips. "This one's called Learning to Fly Again." Darren swallowed. "That's a good name." Abraham grinned. "Mama says people have to learn how to fly even after they've fallen." Cinnamon felt her throat tighten. "I did say that." The boy nodded, pleased with himself. "Then we're all dragons now." Darren chuckled. "I'll take that." That night after Abraham fell asleep, Darren stayed a little longer. They stood by the window, the same one where she used to watch the storms, the same one where she'd once told him to leave. The lake shimmered under moonlight, silver ripples chasing the breeze. "He's happy again," Darren said softly. Cinnamon nodded. "He's strong. Stronger than both of us." Darren looked at her, studying the quiet curve of her face in the dim light. "I don't know how to thank you. You don't have to." "I do," he said. "You did what I couldn't. You stayed." She looked at him then, not as the man who had left her, but as the man who had found his way back, not through guilt, but through effort. "I stayed," she said, "because leaving would have meant giving up on him. Not because I wasn't afraid." He smiled faintly. "And now?" She hesitated, then whispered, "Now I'm just tired of being afraid." For a moment, neither spoke. The world outside was nothing but wind and water and the soft pulse of the night. Then Darren reached for her hand slowly, gently, as if asking permission. She didn't pull away. Their fingers met, tentative but real. No promises, no declarations. Just two people holding on, learning again what it meant to trust. The next morning, Cinnamon woke to the smell of pancakes. Abraham was in the kitchen wearing Darren's oversized apron, humming as he stirred the batter. Darren stood beside him, pretending to follow instructions. "Flip it now," Abraham said. "I'm trying, chef." The pancake folded in half, smoke curling from the pan. Cinnamon leaned against the doorway, laughing for the first time in what felt like forever. When they noticed her, Abraham ran over. "Mama." "We made breakfast." She looked at Darren, flour on his sleeve, hair a mess, smile too soft for defense. And suddenly, everything felt easy. "Looks like you finally learned how to cook," she teased. "Not quite," he said, "but I'm learning." Abraham grinned. "Just like flying." And for once, Cinnamon didn't correct him. That afternoon, they took a walk by the lake. The sun glowed gold over the water, scattering reflections like broken glass stitched with light. Abraham ran ahead, chasing the wind, arms outstretched as if they were wings. Cinnamon and Darren walked slower, their steps sinking without effort. He said quietly, "Do you ever wonder what might have happened if we hadn't?" She stopped him with a look. "We don't live there anymore." He smiled, accepting it. Right. We live here. They stood in silence watching their son. His laughter drifted across the lake light, boundless free. Do you think he'll remember all this? Darren asked. Maybe not, she said. But he'll remember how it felt. That's what matters. As the sun dipped lower, Abraham turned, shouting. Come on, race me, Cinnamon laughed. You'll win anyway. Darren's grin flashed boyish and wild. Not if we team up. They ran laughing, the three of them chasing the fading light until their shadows stretched across the ground, long and tangled. When they finally stopped, breathless, Abraham threw his arms around both of them. You guys are slow, he said proudly. Cinnamon kissed his hair. Maybe, but we never stopped trying. Darren met her eyes, and she saw it there. Not the fire of their past, but something steadier. A quiet, enduring flame that had learned after everything how to burn without consuming. Later that night, Abraham's new painting dried on the easel. The two dragons stood side by side, their wings overlapping, one dark, one bright, their scales shimmering where the colors met. Above them, written in a child's uneven scrawl, were three words: We can fly. Cinnamon traced the words with her fingertips, smiling through tears. In the end, they hadn't rebuilt the past. They'd painted something new. And sometimes, she realized, that was how love learned to last, not by being perfect, but by daring to fly again together. A year later, spring returned to Maple Harbor. The lake shimmered with soft gold light, its surface calm again after so many seasons of storms. The air carried the faint scent of lavender, the kind Cinnamon planted along the studio windows, the kind that bloomed only when the air was warm enough to forgive winter. Inside, the studio had been transformed. Where there were once scattered brushes and half-finished sketches, now there were candles, framed art, and laughter. No grand ballroom, no orchestra, just family, friends, and the sound of joy that needed no decoration. It was their wedding day. Cinnamon had never imagined marrying again, not because she didn't believe in love, but because she no longer trusted forever. Forever to her had once meant broken promises and long nights watching the rain. Forever had meant giving without knowing whether anyone would stay. But now, as she stood in her simple cream dress, bare feet on wooden floors that once held their tears, she realized forever didn't have to be flawless. It just had to be true. Abraham tugged at the hem of her dress, his suit slightly oversized, his curls refusing to behave. You look like one of your paintings, Mama, he said proudly. She smiled. And what does that mean? That you shine, he said simply. Her heart swelled, not from the compliment, but from knowing that light in his eyes had finally come back. Darren stood near the front of the room, his hands steady for once. He'd built his life on control markets, negotiations, numbers that always made sense. But nothing about this moment felt measurable. He looked at Cinnamon and felt everything he'd tried to name for years. Love, loss, redemption, collapse into something wordless and whole. He had bought companies, funded hospitals, rebuilt his empire after loss. But this small, sunlit studio filled with lavender and laughter was the first thing in his life that felt like enough. When she walked toward him, barefoot and smiling, he nearly forgot to breathe. The ceremony was quiet. No priest, no vows scripted by tradition. Just them and the boy who had unknowingly saved them both. Abraham stood between them, holding a folded letter. His hands trembled slightly, but his eyes were clear. I wrote something, he said shyly, his voice echoing through the little studio. Everyone stilled. He unfolded the paper and began to read. Once upon a time, he began, there were two dragons. They were strong and brave, but they were also lonely. They thought they couldn't fly in the same sky because their wings were too different. So one flew toward the light, and the other hid in the dark. But the wind, the same wind that once pushed them apart, started whispering. It said, "You belong to the same sky." And when they finally flew close enough to touch, something amazing happened. The wind didn't break them. It lifted them higher. Cinnamon pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. Darren's eyes glistened. Abraham continued, his smile bright and sure. Now they fly together. Not perfectly. Sometimes they bump wings and almost fall. But they keep flying because that's what dragons do when they love each other. He looked up from the page, his voice soft. And I get to fly with them. The room went silent, except for the sound of someone quietly crying, then laughter gentle and full of warmth. Darren bent down and hugged his son, voice breaking. "You're the best thing we ever made, kid." Abraham squeezed tighter. "I know." When it was their turn to speak, Darren took Cinnamon's hands. For a moment, neither said anything. Words felt too small for the distance they'd traveled, from strangers to lovers, from storm to sunlight, from guilt to grace. Finally, he spoke. "I've lost everything before," he said. "Money, people, my sense of who I was. But I realized something: none of it ever mattered until the day I lost you." Cinnamon's eyes shimmered. He swallowed hard, his voice cracking. "It took me years to understand that the best deal I ever made wasn't in a boardroom. It was that night when you walked into that hotel room, and I didn't know that love could look like redemption." He paused, blinking through tears. "I lost the world once, but I found it again in you and in him, and I won't lose it twice." Cinnamon squeezed his hands. The sunlight streaming through the window turned her skin to gold. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried. "I used to think love was something we could hold, something we could own." She looked at him, eyes tender and knowing. "But love isn't possession. It's becoming. You don't hold it. It holds you, until you grow into the person it always believed you could be." He smiled through the tears. "You make everything sound holy." "Maybe it is," she said softly. "Maybe forgiveness is the closest thing we have to heaven." They exchanged rings, simple silver, unadorned. When Darren slipped hers onto her finger, she felt its cool weight, not as a promise of forever, but as a quiet reminder they had already survived the worst. They didn't need grand vows, just the courage to stay. The guests applauded softly. Someone started clapping. Someone else whistled. And Abraham, grinning from ear to ear, shouted, "Now kiss already." Laughter filled the studio. Darren pulled Cinnamon close and kissed her. Not the kind of kiss that belonged in movies, but the kind that belonged to real people who had earned it inch by inch, year by year. Outside, the wind stirred the lavender fields, carrying the scent of new beginnings. Later, when the guests were gone and the candles burned low, they stood by the open window. Abraham was asleep in the next room, curled under a blanket, his hand still clutching the corner of his drawing. Cinnamon leaned against Darren's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" she asked. He chuckled softly. "Every day. And I still don't know how you said yes." She smiled. "Because you stopped trying to fix me. You just stood still long enough to let me heal." Outside, the lake shimmered under the moonlight. Darren brushed a stray curl from her cheek. "You know, for a man who once thought love was a transaction, I think I finally broke even." She laughed low and warm. "You didn't break even, Darren." He raised a brow. "No, you won." The night deepened. The lavender swayed gently in the wind, brushing against the open window frame. And then, as if the universe itself was listening, a sudden gust swept through, scattering petals across the floor. They drifted toward the canvas propped near the wall, Abraham's newest painting. 3 dragons, one white, one dark, one small, soared together across a sky painted in every color he could find. Their wings overlapped their shadows, blending into gold. At the bottom, in a child's careful handwriting, were the words, "The sky is big enough for all of us." Cinnamon smiled through her tears. He's right. Darren kissed the top of her head. He usually is. The candles flickered low, their flames soft and steady. Outside, the stars blinked above the lake, their reflections rippling like 1,000 whispered blessings. Cinnamon leaned her head on his shoulder, her voice barely audible. "We're not perfect." "No," he said, "but we're real." And somewhere between that imperfection and the peace that followed, the world felt whole again. Because after every storm, light doesn't come back all at once. It comes in flickers, in laughter, in hands that choose to stay in love, that learns how to begin again. Outside, Abraham stirred in his sleep and smiled. In his dream, the 3 dragons flew higher than ever before, carried not by wind or fate, but by something quieter, stronger. Faith, forgiveness, love reborn. And when the first light of dawn crept across the sky, it touched the studio window, spilling across their faces. A soft golden promise, whispered into a world finally at peace. Because in the end, love isn't about finding someone to live with. It's about finding the one who teaches you how to live. The end.